those for us. We have had a few people in the congregation have not been well, and I'd like to lift up those names. Dolly Berthelot is at home now, but she is struggling with health problems. Hedwig Anderson had carpal tunnel surgery last week. Keep her in the thoughts. And Nadine Hubble has not been well. Joe Vinson shares with us that his dad's cancer treatments have remained effective, and effective enough that he and Joe's mom were able to travel to Hawaii last week, and they're very grateful for this. Denise Gunn has a sorrow. A friend of hers, 22-year-old daughter, has died.
Oh.
And another friend's cancer has returned, and hospice has been called in. Sorry to hear that. Lisa Rawson is happy to share with us that she has a new job with H&R Block, and that her puppy, Ruthie, is growing and almost sleeping through the night. We all know that story. Patty Underwood, she is thanking all who brought food for the first Sunday for Manna Food Pantry. We donated 52 pounds of food. That's wonderful. Penny is sharing that she attended the UU Jewish Awareness New Year's of the Trees on Friday night, and it was an enlightening Seder. And Paula has a sorrow. Her brother, Holt Montgomery, who lives alone in Oxford, Mississippi, has been having health problems and has had need to go to the ER multiple times in the last 2 weeks. We will light one last candle for those joys and sorrows that are Scott and insufficient funds.
All right, thank you so much. Can you all hear me okay in the back? So thank you so much for coming out today. And also want to thank the choir. Y'all sounded really nice and heard the practices for the last song when we get to that. And I'm very happy with this. When I threw this to Laura when she was asking about what we were going to be doing in the songs, and I told her that I want to do this 1800 style, so we're just not going to do any technology or nothing. And she came out there and she was able to bring out the thunder. So I appreciate you doing this, so thank you so much. And also Marylee for the service. And also Duke Ellington, who you heard as you were coming in. That's the song Come Sunday. And then also the one that you'll leave with is Duke Ellington's Emancipation Proclamation. Just so you know when you hear it. So I don't know how many of you know this, but the song that we heard earlier, Amazing Grace, again done beautifully by the choir, was originally a song very closely connected to the anti-slavery movement. The author, a man named John Newton, wrote the song not terribly long after he left the business of trafficking in human beings. Yes, the author of Amazing Grace was a captain of a slave ship. One day at sea, a violent storm overtook his ship. The man who had just relieved him was swept overboard. Newton felt that night would be his last. So in desperation, this unholy man began to pray. Like many people faced to a certain death, he made all sorts of bargains to God, including a promise to change his wrong-headed ways, chiefly his involvement in the slave trade. He didn't have an overnight conversion, but soon found God and left the slave trade for good. becoming a powerful force in the anti-slavery movement. The song was originally a poem and then set to music years later. There's even some debate over whether or not the original tune was an African tune set in Africa. Since this is hard to confirm, I won't take a side, but what is confirmable was that Newton's hard work contributed greatly to the anti-slavery movement by writing this one song. Now, when we think of John Newton or that song, what we hear is a song of redemption. Someone was lost, but then found. Someone was blind, but later could see. In a way, this song is a sort of apology for his own role in the enslavement of Africans and participation in the Atlantic slave trade. If you take that leap with me, which isn't a far leap if you read his autobiography, you can see Newton admitting and apologizing for his role in slavery, ironically, around the year 1776. The same year, African slavery had taken place on this land for at least 157 years. Over 200 years if we go back to the Spanish here in Pensacola, in this land specifically, and St. Augustine, but we'll stick with the English for right now. When did the United States Congress apologize for slavery? Anybody? 2009. You can do the math yourself, but between 1619 and 2009 is a long time, which makes Newton's apology very interesting. While a lot of people don't know the origins of the song Amazing Grace, or even the history of John Newton, who really is an interesting person too, so it's worth taking a look at. Him and also a poet named William Cooper. They are famous for writing the only hymns, but were almost drafted into the anti-slavery movement that just became these pretty strong forces. History has clearly looked favorably upon John Newton. Two somewhat recent movies came out about the song alone, and a number of books as well. Why has Newton been looked on so favorably? Because Newton, arguably, was on the right side of history. As many of you know, I wear many hats, primarily a father. Son's in there in the sound room right now. A husband, Lauren's out there in the audience, a son, Jane Ramsey's son. But I'm also an educator, a writer, and a historian. Being a historian who writes a lot about racial struggles in this country, one truth that's risen to the top is who is on the quote-unquote right side of history. Obviously, that term is subjective and reflective of various periods of time, but in general, the people on the side of racial justice tend to be viewed favorably. I'd ask you to think of yourself in the future and how future generations will look at you and your actions right now. What side of history are you on? How would future generations know? Would your descendants know where you stood? Why or why not? I wouldn't say it's a guiding force in my life, because that would make it seem like I'm constantly thinking about the subject. But I do think about it often. How will future generations view my actions today? What about my inactions? What about the times I sat on the fence? How could I explain my present-day actions to future generations? Would my descendants be proud of me? While this church has never shied away from courageous moves and doing what's right, as testified by the memorial outside the door we often pass, dedicated to the victims of anti-abortion terrorism, which a lot of you know way too well. I'm standing next to a piano dedicated to a church member who was assassinated by a terrorist in 1994. A lot of you knew him, were friends with him. But as you also likely know, the UU Church's history is filled with martyrs to social justice and struggles, including a minister and lay member of the church murdered after the March for Voting Rights in Selma in '65. Many Unitarians, Universalists, were famously active in the abolitionist movements, including the author and activist Francis C.W. Harper, and many, many others. It's a part of our history at the church, certainly, but who among us would have been bold enough to go to Selma in '65? I'd hope I would, but I don't know. I know some of you might have had those options. Some of you know people that went. Some of you marched in your own struggles many times and continue to do so. But unless you were there at that time, none of us could know for sure what we would do. But there are other opportunities. There's a phrase that I've seen make the rounds a number of times over the past couple of years. If you've wondered what it would be like to live during the Civil Rights Movement and wondered what you would do during the Civil Rights Movement, you don't have to wonder. It's happening right now. As you know, this Monday is a nationally recognized holiday marking Martin Luther King's birthday. While MLK has a wide range of speeches, I thought I'd spend a few minutes on the I Have a Dream speech and move past that 1963 speech to another one he made in 1967. As for the I Have a Dream speech, why that one? We all know it, right? What does he say in that speech? Or more importantly, what can I say that you don't already know? Well, if you move past the sound bites, move past the short excerpts you'll hear over the weekend, you'll find much more in that speech. First, he opens up by bringing the audience to where he is, to the feet of Abraham Lincoln, in whose symbolic shadow we stand. In whose symbolic cup I'll drink right now. It's my Lincoln cup. And why is he there 100 years after the 1863 Emancipation Proclamation? Why is he there 100 years after this went into effect? These are the things that he talks about in the very first lines of the speech. 50 years ago. Who else speaks like that? Scores. Lincoln. So he's bringing you right back to Lincoln. Yet besides marking the historic anniversary, King is somewhat specific in what he says are his reasons for the march. I'm quoting from King. In a sense, we've come to our nation's capital to cash a check. When the architects of our republic wrote the magnificent words of the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence, they were signing a promissory note to which every American was to fall heir. This note was a promise that all men, yes, black men as well as white men, would be guaranteed the unalienable rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. It is obvious today that America has defaulted on this promissory note insofar as her citizens of color are concerned. I don't know about y'all. No, I'm speaking. I don't know about y'all, but when I went to school, we didn't hear about King coming to D.C. with a check. And the government saying, sorry, Dr. King, we're broke. The language he uses in this speech is very clear, using terms and phrases that are specific in nature, metaphorical in some ways, but way too specific to be glossed over when he makes a number of very specific references in the speech. If we don't remember that part of the speech, what do we remember from the speech? Yes, he had a dream. We remember that part. We understand all of this, but why do we focus on the latter half so much, but forget the first parts of the speech so quickly? We know the last words, free at last, thank God Almighty, we are free at last. In some ways, it's as if we are a nation that is free at last from having to finally address the issue of historic and systemic racism and the past wrongs of slavery just by focusing on those few lines. King speaks of the Declaration of Independence and the Emancipation Proclamation, two documents that aren't exactly what we tend to think of them as, but are both two founding documents of our country, 1776 and 1863. The Declaration of Independence, breaking free from England, the Emancipation Proclamation, making more true the promise of the Declaration. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. While the Emancipation Proclamation didn't actually free many people initially, and certainly did make the country a land of equality, it started moving us towards a quote-unquote more perfect union. Yet as King pointed out, 100 years after emancipation, African American people were still not free. not only concerning the vote, but also economically, as so much of our wealth created by African American labor was stolen, and even after emancipation, the theft continued through periods of Reconstruction, what's called the White Redemption period, which is the period that follows Reconstruction, Jim Crow, which I'm sure that a lot of you are familiar with, and arguably to our present day, with what many people are calling Jim Crow 2.0. If indeed we hold these truths to be self-evident, that we are all created equal, why is there so much inequality in this country? Though historic and systemic racism is not the only reason, race and class are so closely intertwined in this country, it's almost impossible to address one without addressing the other. The I Have a Dream speech is arguably the most famous speech in U.S. history. Seriously, stop for a second and think of a speech, besides Lincoln, that you know more than 2 lines from. I'll give you a second. You got it. 20th century at least. I ask my students, why do we return to this one speech so often? And their reply is because it's continually relevant, meaning race is at the center of our story, which also means that racial injustice is at the center of our story. While King speaks about judging someone by the content of their character instead of the color of their skin in the speech, he goes further. He also talks about police brutality, applauds militants, dismisses the idea of gradualism, and the several slippery slope arguments people often make for progress and change. Where do these requests for justice lead? People often ask. When will it end? He simply throws them out and tries to get his white audience to empathize with him and find out how it would feel to be told that you're moving too fast on promise given to you 100 years ago. That you're moving too fast on a promise that was given prior to granting basic freedoms and redress the historic and incredible wrongs, specifically of slavery, an institution that's so large and brutal that it knows no parallels in world history. While addressing the crimes of slavery, and I say that too because often people say that there was slavery in other countries or slavery existed before. That's true, but there's really nothing that compares to the African slave trade for as long as it was and as brutal as it was, and specifically racially based as well. So I just want to make that point. While addressing the claims of slavery is not what people generally think of when it comes to this speech, it's telling that King begins this speech essentially begins the speech and ends the speech with references to slavery. In this one speech alone, the most famous U.S. speech in history, King is bringing all of us to the table with incredible patience and love while asking this question: what side of history will you be on? Sadly, over the next few days, the speech will be used out of context numerous times. Few, if any, news outlets will even share the speech in its entirety. Few of any other speeches that King made will be shared. Therefore, the message will be the typical sanitized King that's trapped in amber. We're not going to hear any of the other speeches, in particular the Beyond Vietnam speech, that you could easily take out the words Vietnam and switch with Iraq, with Better Peace, as he built out here in the audience, and we return to quite often. And it's prophetic in the way, it's prophetic and sad that you could interchange those words quite often, but also speaks to him even realizing at some level his longevity. While we hear a lot from those other 2 quotes that I mentioned before, the content of their character and free at last that he spoke of, we'll definitely not hear King praise the youth militancy, his scorching lines about police brutality, his open discussion of slavery at the beginning and end, and we'll almost certainly not hear his speech used as an argument for economic redress or reparations for slavery and Jim Crow. Almost, certainly. Now for a second, let's move to a 1967 speech he gave in Charleston, South Carolina. He gave his Beyond Vietnam speech in 1967 as well, on the anniversary, what would have been the anniversary, or I should say, 1 year to the day before he was assassinated. But he also gave another speech a few months later during this summer in 1967 in Charleston, South Carolina. Charleston, South Carolina is the home of the abolitionist and revolutionary Denmark Vesey, as well as a city that a lot of us unfortunately become familiar with when several parishioners of the Emmanuel AME Church were assassinated by white supremacists. King spoke here in 1967 in Charleston. Spoke in Charleston in 1967 as the country's costly war in Vietnam raged and cities across the country burned in racial uprisings. At this time, King was saying to a nation which spends more money, a nation that spends more money on bombs but cannot feed its people is nearing spiritual death. He's going around the country actively organizing at the same time for what would have been the March on Washington, the Poor People's Campaign. This was his attempt to bring poor people of all races, economically disenfranchised people from all across the country, poor white folks in the Appalachians, impoverished Chicano workers out west, poor black Southerners, along with people everywhere, together to D.C. to find redress for all of their grievances. King saw all of our fates intertwined, but also recognized the specific and historic issues that had still not been redressed in the black communities of America. Here's what King said, unquote from King, because most people don't know this speech. In 1863, the Negro was freed from the bondage of physical slavery through the Emancipation Proclamation signed by Abraham Lincoln. But the Negro was not given any land to make that freedom meaningful. And you know something like having a man in jail for years and years, and then you suddenly discover that this man is innocent, and go to him and say, now you're free. The man been unjustly jailed for 35 or 40 years, and you just put him out of jail saying, now you're free. You don't give him any bus fare to get to town, no money to buy clothes, no money to get something to eat. This is what happened to the black man in this country. He was just told that you're free. Been enslaved for 244 years. He didn't have any family life because it was a crime for the Negro during slavery to get married. They destroyed the Negro family. He didn't have any money because he didn't get paid anything. He didn't have any education because it was a crime for a Negro to learn to read and write actually during these days of slavery. Some Negroes slipped away and tried to write and would get their hands chopped off. Now from here, that's a quote, all this from King. From here, King goes and returns specifically to the subject of reparations. Now, America must hear about its sins because we will never understand what is happening in this country today without understanding what we are now reaping, the harvest of terrible, evil planted seed centuries ago. Yes, we were given emancipation, but no land to make it meaningful. And you know what? At the same time, America was giving away millions of acres of land in the West and the Midwest. It was said that the nation was willing to undergird its white peasants from Europe with an economic floor. Yet it would not do it for those who had been in the land. It brought here in chains 244 years, so emancipation for the Negro was freedom to hunger. Decades after the March on Washington, the 1963 March on Washington, King's dream remains that, a dream. The stumbling blocks for economic redress and even basic voting rights continue to be the same thing, as evidenced by our daily political news. The white moderates, and King addresses this quite in detail in his letter from Birmingham jail. It says there, and I'm just going to paraphrase, that the biggest stumbling block for African Americans is not the White Citizens Council or the Ku Klux Klaner, but is the white moderates who are telling us to go slow. So seeing this, and we can probably think, how this is working in our political system now, with a little bit of moderation, stopping a lot of things that are happening, pretty important things that are happening. So we look at this and we ask ourselves, what do we do? Should we feel guilty because King's mission is complete? Yeah, totally we should feel guilty. While King was certainly human, just like any of us, and had his faults, we'd be hard-pressed to find another major figure in American history as prophetic about our future, but inspiring as well, because he saw the aspirations of this country and saw the aspirations in earlier documents and was willing to use those documents to speak truth to power. We should move forward today with King's courage as well as the courage of the countless people that will never know all their names, our spiritual and moral ancestors, and wrestle with the difficult questions, as well as help lift this country and help us as a country to lift every voice through our words, but more importantly, through our actions. As theologian James H. Cone wrote, "Truth knows no color. It appeals to intelligence." This is something the Unitarian, Universalists have always prided ourselves on. So I'll give you that quote again. "Truth knows no color. It appeals to intelligence." We have that history here in this church. Now history is asking us, what side will we stand on? And I hope that we'll make the right decisions. Thank you very much.
Now I invite the choir to come forward. Lift every voice. Can you hear me? Lift every voice. I believe that's what? 149. 149.
With the harmonies of
think the importance of doing activist work is precisely because it allows you to give back and to consider yourself not as a single individual who may have achieved whatever, but to be a part of an ongoing historical movement. That's Angela Davis. Hit it, Des.